Breath of the Wild was a fantastic launch title for the Switch, and while it certainly wasn't perfect as a game, it was easily one of the most memorable open-world experiences I've ever had. One of the biggest criticisms it received, however, was the very little amount of story present in the game. While Breath of the Wild wasn't devoid of one, the game's overall setup made having a more in-depth story pretty difficult, with most of that having happened a century prior to the start of the game. 3.5 years after its release, though, fans would be treated to a new Hyrule Warriors and a prequel to Breath of the Wild with Age of Calamity. Gameplay-wise, I knew I'd have a great time, having really enjoyed the first Hyrule Warriors. Story-wise, though, I wasn't really sure what to expect from it at all when it first came out. Having played through Breath of the Wild, I wasn't really sure what more there was to tell about 100 years ago. Needless to say, though, Age of Calamity wasn't quite what anyone was expecting, and whether this is a good thing or not kinda depends on who you ask. I personally enjoyed the story it told, but for a few reasons, I can understand if others aren't a fan. Without any further delays though, let's jump right on in and look back at the last game in Breath of the Wild story before Tears of the Kingdom releases. Our story starts on the day of Ganon's awakening. During the Guardian's attack on the castle, a stray explosion knocks a box in Zelda's study over, revealing a tiny egg-shaped Guardian. This Guardian, whom I'll be referring to as Egg Friend since his name isn't revealed until very late into the game, after hearing Zelda's wish to protect everyone, uses the power of Sheikah technology to travel back in time to alter the course of history and prevent the apocalypse. Not even 10 minutes into the game yet, and already we have something that doesn't quite line up with the events of 100 years ago, with the addition of Egg Friend. The reality here is that Age of Calamity isn't totally a full-on prequel like some might think, and it's more of an alternate universe. Which, in all honesty, is kinda fair, cause if this were one-to-one with the normal events, then Link would have the Master Sword right from the beginning, because canonically he's had that thing for most of his life. Now, I'm no game designer, but I can't imagine giving the player complete, unrestricted access to what is actually the most powerful sacred weapon in both Hyrule and very likely the whole world right from the beginning is anything close to a good idea. Now, to be fair to the game though, I wouldn't say Age of Calamity not being a true prequel means it doesn't add anything to Breath of the Wild's story, because that's simply untrue. The best thing Age of Calamity does for the overall story is give us more time with the champions and other characters who needed it. In Breath of the Wild, while I liked the champions, I didn't get enough time to really grow super attached to them. With Age of Calamity though, I finally got the time I needed, and I kinda love these guys. As always, Mipha was a sweet cinnamon roll, and just like in Breath of the Wild, I loved her interactions with Link. Urbosa was as cool as always, and I loved her relationship with Zelda. They didn't get a ton of little moments, but I really like how they feel like family, despite not being related. As for Daruk though, he's just a lovable ham. I don't even have that much to say about him, he's just a joy to have on screen. One of my favorite moments from him very early on is when he offers Link a rock roast, not because it's a kind gesture, but because Link actually manages to eat the thing. Revali's about as arrogant as you can get, but by God did Age of Calamity prove he can put his money where his beak is. Guy's about as skilled as he makes himself out to be, and I kinda love him for it. There are others I could bring up, but I'd rather save them for the spoiler section, so I can go into a bit more detail. With that said though, I think it's time we moved on to the Hyrule Warriors part of this game's title, cause let me tell ya, revisiting this game after a year reminded me of just how fun it was. Alright, so before we actually begin this section off properly, I'd just like to say that the gameplay you're seeing here of Link mowing down hundreds of bokoblin is surprisingly enough actually lore accurate to this version of him. He's beaten fully trained soldiers in a sword fight at the age of 6 according to Mipha's diary in the DLC, and if you remember the Elden memory in Breath of the Wild, Link fought off a horde of monsters including multiple black Lynels, all without so much as a scratch. If we're talking raw physical capability and swordsmanship skills, the hero of the wild is more than likely the strongest, cause I don't think any other Link is as much of a unit on their own as this one is. With that little side tangent out of the way though, let's get back to the actual point of this section with Age of Calamity's incredibly satisfying and fun gameplay. The game of course plays similarly to Hyrule Warriors, with each level having you capture enemy keeps to take control of the battlefield and fulfilling whatever objectives come up. This time around though, because the game's a prequel to Breath of the Wild, it used some of the mechanics in that game for its combat system, like the Sheikah Slate. Along with each character's light and heavy combos, they also have access to the 4 base rune abilities. They can have more general applications in combat, but you'll be predominantly using them against certain enemy types. Bokoblins and Lizalfos can be taken out no problem, just keep smacking them and you'll have no issues. But enemies like Moblins, Wizrobes, etc. all have a much larger health pool, and if you want to do a lot of damage real quick, you'll need to break their guard for a weak point strike. Depending on the enemy, they'll have an attack or two that'll give you a Sheikah rune prompt, and if executed, will open them up to weaken their guard. Alternatively, you can just wait for their guard to open up normally, or you can get a well-placed headshot to open them up. What I love about the rune abilities though is that they're not always the same amongst each character. Link's work how they do previously, but Impa's bomb rune fires off one AoE explosion, Zelda's bombs summon an explosive drone that fires off its own bombs, and so on and so forth. I like how much uniqueness this adds to each character. It can give you a few more reasons to use a specific one over another, and on the note of them, let's talk about a few of my favorites. Starting with Link himself, he was honestly my go-to character for most levels. He's the most well-rounded in terms of speed and power, and is generally fairly versatile. Also, if I'm being completely honest, I just love using the Master Sword. Mowing down hordes of enemies with the Master Sword's full health beam is so fun. I sometimes find myself actually wasting my healing just so I can keep using the beam. As for another reason I like using Link, his bow and arrow are pretty useful for getting headshots off on stronger enemies like Moblins or Hinox. Zelda is, I think, the weirdest one to use because she actually uses the Sheikah Slate for all of her attacks. It can take a little getting used to, but I like how she fights. Her fighting style's a bit unorthodox, but it's weirdly kinda versatile. Monk Mazkoshia was a really cool character to be able to use after having recently replayed Breath of the Wild, and while he's a bit weird to use like Zelda, I really liked him. Mazkoshia's whole thing is that his attacks can summon Sheikah relics that he can then destroy to get energy from. Using this, you can have him deliver a harder hitting attack with him in his giant form, which was pretty cool to use. On a bit of a different note though, I'd actually like to mention something that Age of Calamity actually does a bit better than Breath of the Wild. Enemy variety. It's nothing much, but along with all the base enemies, we now also have elementally charged enemies. After a certain point, you'll start seeing boss monsters that are charged with either fire, ice, or lightning. Aside from looking cooler, this will of course let them do elemental damage, and unless they're electric typed, it even gives them an elemental weakness. You see, every character has access to 3 elemental rods they can use in combat to quickly bombard an enemy should it have any charges left. These can be useful for helping break an enemy's guard if the conditions are right, and for fire and ice enemies, if you use the opposite element, you can greatly open them up for damage to their guard. Admittedly, the element-charged enemies don't add that much more variety compared to the base game, but hey, an improvement is still an improvement. I think my favorite part of both the gameplay and the story missions, though, are the Divine Beast segments. They're not very long at all, but being able to actually pilot the Divine Beast to fight thousands of monsters is the coolest thing. Of the 4, I think Va Naboris is my favorite. It had my favorite sections out of all the Divine Beasts, and calling down lightning just feels good, even if I don't like that said lightning has a battery gauge. Aside from the story and Divine Beast levels though, you also have the game's many challenges. These are a series of much shorter levels that reward you with a variety of materials for completing requests and even cooking. Doing challenges can also net you some extra weapons for you to use in battle or even for fusing with other weapons at the blacksmith for more damage. Proper fusion can even get weapons upwards of 3 bonus effects to help you in battle, like more materials and damage. By completing various requests for the people of Hyrule, you can unlock things like stables in various shops as well as buff a character's combos by adding more attacks and even getting them more health. Cooking meals before a fight can, of course, also get you other bonus effects, but it's possible you may have to grind for cooking materials in older levels to make certain recipes. As a whole, I really love Age of Calamity's gameplay and combat. Like any good Warriors game, it feels great and is pretty fun to play, but now's about time we talk more about the biggest draw for this game, its story. There's a lot I want to talk about, so if you want to avoid spoilers, skip to here, or click the link in the description to skip to the next chapter. With the warning out of the way, let's get started. Alright, so before we begin this properly, I'd like to quickly talk about 2 things. First off, Master Koga is an absolute treasure, and I love whenever he's on screen. He's hilarious, incredibly charming, and his extra characterization really helps me to like the Yiga clan more. Secondly, and this is the most important one of the 2, they redeemed the Blight Ganons. They look so much cooler here. Like, I love how they're different colors now, and the extra weaponry and details are great touches. This sounds really unfair to say, but I don't know why they didn't look like this from the start. If they did, I feel like a lot more people would have liked these guys, because both visually speaking and fight-wise, they're a lot better here. With that out of the way though, let's talk about my one negative with the game's story, Aster. As a villain, he's very blah. Aster pretty much just works as Ganon's henchman to help bring about the calamity, and after he's lost his usefulness, Ganon has him for a snack. Xanter Girahim served a similar role as henchmen, but they had a stronger personality to them, and a lot of memorable moments. Aster's most memorable moment is him being used as fuel for Ganon's new really cool physical form. People rag on Calamity Ganon for not having much personality and character, and while that's fair, at least in his case, that's sort of the point. He's a force of nature type villain. The focus is meant to be on how he affects the world, not who he is as a person. Don't get me wrong, Aster is far from the worst villain I've ever seen, but I wish they did a bit more with him. This is contrasted with my favorite aspect of this story in Breath of the Wild as a whole though, Zelda. While this isn't my favorite version of Zelda and Link's relationship, this is my favorite version of her as a character. It was great to be able to see more of her struggles with awakening her powers and the burden placed on her as the princess, because quite honestly, I've never been this invested in Zelda as a character before. She started the game unsure of herself, and if she would truly be useful to everyone, and by the end, she's not only awakened to her latent abilities, but she's also become the strong and wise leader Hyrule desperately needs in its darkest hour. Let me tell you, finally being able to use Zelda's powers during Fort Hateno was a great feeling, and while I don't think she's the strongest character in the game, I felt pretty powerful being able to lay the divine smackdown on Ganon's forces. On a sort of related note though, I loved Zelda's relationship with Terrako. It's a simple one, but I love how the little guy kinda becomes an emotional support egg for Zelda during her rougher moments. I also just love how he plays Zelda's lullaby to comfort her. It's a cute touch. Now's about time we address the time-traveling elephant in the room though, Terrako and this game being an alternate timeline. Personally, I'm fine with it, but I can understand why others wouldn't be. I would imagine when most people bought this game, they fully expected to get a complete retelling of the events of 100 years ago. If you felt a little cheated for getting this instead, I can't say you're wrong for feeling that way. Honestly, I think they went this route for one big reason. They were worried they would mostly be retreading old information. Let's compare Age of Calamity to another prequel game, Torna the Golden Country. To the uninitiated, the latter was a DLC game for Xenoblade Chronicles 2, meant to expand on an event called the Aegis War. The difference between the two games, though, is that in base Xenoblade 2, we barely see anything of the Aegis War. We pretty much only get information from word of mouth and very, very few flashbacks, so when you play the DLC blind, you won't totally know what to expect. With Breath of the Wild, though, we already know all of the important bits of 100 years ago, because we physically see it in Link's memories. I could easily be wrong here, but if Age of Calamity's story was a true retelling, they would just be repeating stuff we already knew. I can't say that the story we got couldn't have been handled a bit better, of course, with elements like Aster, but in this situation, I don't think they had many options for how they could have handled this as a prequel without having some kind of problem. As a whole, though, I liked it for what it was, flaws and all. Here's to hoping that if we get an Age of Calamity 2, though, we can get a better villain, cause Aster's kinda lame. As a prequel to Breath of the Wild, Age of Calamity is kinda weird, but I think it's a good kinda weird. It's not going to be what you expected, but personally I kinda like that. The story does enough to give me more of an appreciation for characters like Zelda and the champions, while also giving me more time in a version of Hyrule I love. It's not perfect by any means, but I can't really complain too much. As a Hyrule Warriors game though, I love how it adapts mechanics from the base game for its combat, and ignoring that this is technically a different style of game altogether, I actually like this game's combat more than Breath of the Wild's, even if only because I like having more diverse combos. Honestly, after playing through both games again, it's still kinda crazy for me that Tears of the Kingdom is only a little more than a month away. I've been waiting so long for this, it doesn't totally feel real, it's almost here. That being said though, I got a promise to keep, so next time we'll finally be talking about Daemon X Machina, and I promise I'll try my hardest not to get this video delayed for any number of reasons. Thank you all for watching, like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and I hope you all have a nice day.